Have you ever noticed how quickly anger can spark? One careless word, a sharp glance, or a simple misunderstanding, and suddenly there's a fire burning inside you. It rises in your chest, tightens your throat, and clouds your mind. You feel it before you even have time to think. A heat, a surge, a wave that demands to be unleashed. It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, so fleeting, can trigger a storm within us. A few syllables from a stranger, an old insult from a family member, or a driver cutting you off in traffic, and in an instant your peace is gone. Why is that? Why do we get angry so easily, and why does it feel so powerful? In ancient Buddhist teachings, anger is known as one of the three poisons, along with greed and ignorance. These are the root causes of all suffering in the world. Anger, or san in Pali, is like an invisible fire that burns not only its target but the one who holds it. The Buddha taught that holding onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. But here's the deeper truth. Anger is not something outside of us. It's not given to us by others. It's born from within, from the unmet expectations, the fragile ego, and the deep-seated fears we carry like shadows. There's a story I heard long ago. A monk walking through a village encountered a man notorious for his temper. As the monk passed, the man hurled insults at him, words sharp as knives meant to wound. Yet the monk didn't respond. He simply kept walking, his face calm, his eyes steady. The man grew angrier, shouting louder, hoping to provoke a reaction. But the monk remained silent. Finally, the man stormed off in frustration. Later, a young boy who witnessed the scene asked the monk, "Why didn't you say anything? Weren't you angry?" The monk smiled gently and replied, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" It's a simple lesson, but one that reveals so much about the nature of anger. Most of us believe we are justified in our anger. We convince ourselves that our rage is righteous, that it's a weapon to defend our pride, our honor, or our beliefs. But in truth, anger rarely punishes the person it's aimed at. More often, it poisons the heart of the one who harbors it. Physically, anger triggers a cascade of chemical reactions. Adrenaline surges, the heart pounds, the breath shortens, and the mind narrows its focus to the perceived threat. It feels urgent, it feels important, it demands action. And yet moments after the outburst, what remains? Regret, shame, a fractured relationship, a deepening loneliness. Buddhist philosophy doesn't deny the existence of anger. It acknowledges it as part of the human experience. But it teaches us to understand its roots. Anger often arises from three subtle sources: attachment, when we cling too tightly to what we desire and the world denies us; ego, when our sense of self feels threatened or diminished; fear, when uncertainty makes us feel powerless. When you see anger as a messenger rather than an enemy, it becomes easier to step back, to ask yourself, what is this anger trying to protect? What fear lies beneath it? There's another old parable about a man on a river. He's paddling his small boat in the fog when suddenly another boat crashes into his. Furious, he shouts at the other boatman, cursing his carelessness. But as the mist clears, he realizes the boat was empty, drifting aimlessly with the current. The lesson: the boat was never to blame. It was his own mind that created the anger. How often in our lives are we shouting at empty boats? How many times do we waste our peace on situations beyond our control? Anger doesn't solve problems. It rarely changes others. What it does flawlessly is rob us of clarity. It blinds the eye of wisdom. It tightens the grip of ego. And it leaves us carrying a burden heavier than any insult or slight. In the world we live in today, where outrage spreads like wildfire and every voice demands to be heard, Anger has become a currency. The louder you shout, the more attention you draw. But attention built on anger is fleeting. It leaves behind scorched earth. The great masters knew this. That's why silence, not retaliation, is the highest form of strength. It's not weakness. It's not defeat. It's choosing not to drink the poison. Imagine how different life would be if we paused before responding. If we chose presence over pride, stillness over fury. What if, instead of feeding the fire, we let it die out, starving it of the air it craves? The first step is understanding the nature of anger, recognizing the fire as it begins to spark within us. And that's what we'll explore now. Not through suppression or denial, but by uncovering the hidden roots and quiet triggers that lead to the storm. Because once you see it clearly, it no longer controls you. You can almost feel it, can't you? That familiar burn when someone offends you. A sharp comment, an unfair judgment, a betrayal. The mind tightens, the body tenses, and the voice inside rises. How dare they? And before you know it, you've fired the arrow. Words sharper than blades, cold glares like daggers, or worse, silence loaded with contempt. But what we rarely realize in those moments is that the first one pierced is ourselves. In Buddhist wisdom, there's an ancient parable about a man struck by a poisoned arrow. Writhing in pain, he insists on knowing who shot it, their name, their family, why they did it, what kind of bow they used. The people around him beg to remove the arrow first to save his life, but the man refuses. I must know first. By the time his questions could be answered, he would already be dead. It's a powerful image. Because isn't that what anger does to us? When we're hurt, our mind clings to the injustice. We replay the insult, obsess over the offender, plot what we'll say next time. But all the while, the poison is already seeping deeper. The Buddha taught that anger is not just a fleeting emotion. It's a force that blinds the mind, distorts perception, and hardens the heart. It turns people into objects, enemies, obstacles. And in doing so, it robs us of our humanity. Science echoes this ancient truth. Modern research shows that frequent anger increases the risk of heart disease, weakens the immune system, disrupts sleep, and shortens lifespan. When anger becomes a habit, it rewires the brain, reinforcing pathways of hostility and fear. The world begins to look darker. People feel more dangerous. Life seems unjust. But beyond the body, anger poisons the spirit. Have you noticed how it lingers long after the moment has passed? Long after the argument ends, long after the person leaves the room, it sits within you, gnawing, whispering, and sometimes it convinces you that you need it, that your anger makes you strong, that it protects your dignity. But the truth is far crueler. Anger narrows the heart. It builds walls. It turns the open sky of the mind into a small, suffocating room. You can feel it in the way your thoughts spiral, in the heaviness in your chest, in the way joy feels distant, in how laughter sounds foreign. The masters of old knew this. That's why they warned. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You carry the bitterness. You relive the wound. And slowly, it reshapes you. There's a story I once heard about a woman named Ananda. After losing her child in a tragic accident, she directed her rage at the villagers who she believed were responsible. She cursed them, refused their kindness, carried her fury like armor. But over time, her grief festered into resentment, and she began to see enemies where there were none. Friends avoided her. The world felt colder. One evening, an old monk approached her at the riverbank. He said quietly, "Your anger is like a fire. You think it keeps you warm, but it only burns you." And in that simple sentence, she felt the weight she'd carried for years. That's the nature of anger. It's self-consuming, even when it feels justified, especially when it feels righteous. So what can we do? The Buddhist path doesn't ask us to pretend we're never angry. It asks us to see it clearly, to recognize its nature the moment it arises. To feel the heat, notice the tightening, and instead of acting on it, to pause, to breathe. When you pause, even for a second, you reclaim choice. The arrow may still be there, but you're no longer twisting it deeper. Over time, with practice, that space between the spark and your reaction grows wider. What used to feel like an uncontrollable storm becomes a passing cloud. And in that space, wisdom lives. The Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "When another person makes you suffer, it is because they suffer deeply within themselves and their suffering is spilling over. They do not need punishment, they need help." When you see anger as suffering, both yours and theirs, compassion naturally arises. And compassion, as every wise tradition teaches, is the water that extinguishes the fire. In a world so eager to provoke, so quick to rage, choosing peace is a quiet form of rebellion. Not weakness, not passivity, but the deepest kind of strength. And it begins by recognizing the poisoned arrow and choosing to pull it out. There's a strange moment after anger passes. A silence, an emptiness, and often regret. You might remember the sting of a word you threw like a stone, or the look on someone's face after you lashed out. In that quiet aftermath, it becomes clear. Retaliation rarely brings the satisfaction we imagined. In ancient Buddhist teachings, it's said that words are like swords. When unsheathed in anger, they cut deeper than any blade. A physical wound heals. A scar on the heart can last a lifetime. Think back. Have you ever spoken something in fury that even years later echoes in your memory? A cruel insult, a careless threat, a cold dismissal. And though the moment passed, though life carried on, those words stayed lodged like splinters in your conscience. What's remarkable is that while anger rises fast, retaliation sharpens it. It takes that burning impulse and gives it form. A word, a gesture, a revenge. And in doing so, it keeps the fire alive. The Buddha warned of this cycle, that when we respond to harm with harm, to insult with insult, it's like adding fuel to a fire hoping it will go out. Not only do we magnify our suffering, but we chain ourselves to the very people and situations we wish to escape. Retaliation feels instinctive. The mind screams, "I won't let them get away with this. They need to feel what I felt." But what we don't realize is that by striking back, we step into their suffering. We mirror their cruelty. And in that moment, we are no different. There's a reason why wise traditions, from Zen temples to ancient Stoic philosophy, praise restraint. Not because silence is weakness, but because it is control, mastery over the storm inside. When someone insults you, there's a small, fragile space between hearing and responding. A breath's width, a heartbeat, and within that space your future is shaped. Responding with anger escalates. Responding with calm diffuses. It's a simple truth, but a hard practice. There's a story of a wandering monk who once entered a village known for its hostility toward outsiders. As he sat beneath a tree, the townspeople hurled insults at him. They cursed at his robes, mocked his appearance, spat at his feet. But the monk remained unmoved, eyes half closed, breathing steadily. After hours of this, a young boy approached, confused. "Why don't you fight back? Why don't you say anything?" The monk opened his eyes and smiled gently. "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" The boy blinked. "To the one who offered it." "Exactly," the monk said, closing his eyes again. That's the power of non-retaliation. It breaks the chain. It leaves the fire without fuel. It keeps the poison from spreading. Modern psychology confirms what these old stories knew. Retaliation rarely makes us feel better. In fact, it often worsens emotional wounds. Instead of closure, it deepens resentment. Instead of relief, It leaves guilt. Every sharp word you throw in anger binds you tighter to the situation you want to escape. But here's the beautiful truth. You always have a choice. You are not your anger. You are not the sharp words in your head. You are the awareness behind them. The one who can choose to respond with wisdom or not at all. And in that space, that tiny pause, entire wars can be avoided. Families can be saved. Friendships preserved. Inner peace protected. So next time anger surges and your mouth readies its sword, remember this. What you release into the world will echo. You may not control what others say, but you are the master of your reply. And sometimes the sharpest reply is no reply at all. There's a strange kind of power in doing nothing. A quiet strength most people never notice because they're too busy reacting. In a world addicted to instant replies, sharp comebacks, and proving a point, silence feels unnatural, almost weak. But the truth is, it takes far more strength to hold your peace than to unleash your anger. Think about this. When someone insults you, your first instinct is to defend yourself. When someone wrongs you, your gut screams for revenge. It feels natural. It feels justified. But natural doesn't always mean wise, and justified doesn't always mean necessary. The Buddha often spoke of the unshaken mind. A mind that, like a mountain, stands unmoved amid storms of praise or blame. That kind of mind doesn't flinch when provoked. It doesn't need to prove itself. It sees anger for what it is, a passing cloud in the vast, empty sky of awareness. When you don't react, something incredible happens. First, the fire dies in you. Anger left unexpressed naturally burns out because it thrives on attention. It needs your words, your gestures, your retaliation to stay alive. Without it, it dissolves like mist in the morning sun. Second, you break the chain. When you refuse to strike back, you interrupt the ancient cycle of harm. The one that turns small conflicts into feuds, petty slights into lifelong grudges. You create space, and in that space, peace can breathe. There's an old Zen tale of a warrior who approached a wise monk furious. "Monk," he shouted, "I could strike you down this instant and you wouldn't even defend yourself. How could you be so weak?" The monk looked up calm and said, "If someone hands you a gift of anger and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" The warrior was speechless, because in that moment the monk wasn't weak. He was unshakable. He was untouchable. That's the strength of silence. It's not about avoiding conflict because you're afraid. It's about being so rooted, so inwardly clear that no one can pull you from your center. Modern science mirrors this wisdom. Studies on mindfulness and emotional regulation show that when you pause before reacting, your brain's threat response cools. The amygdala, that ancient fight-or-flight center, calms. And the prefrontal cortex, the part of you capable of wisdom, patience, and long-term thinking, takes the wheel. In silence, you reclaim control of your mind. You stop being a puppet yanked around by other people's behavior. But perhaps the most beautiful thing about silence is this: it teaches others by example. When you don't react, you hold up a mirror to the one who does. You reveal their anger for what it is: loud, desperate, powerless in the face of your calm. Over time, even the most aggressive people will soften in the presence of unwavering peace, because nothing exhausts an angry heart faster than indifference. And you discover that you're not as fragile as you thought, that your dignity isn't tied to someone's opinion, that your worth isn't up for debate. Silence isn't emptiness, it's presence, it's mastery, it's the wisdom to choose peace over pointless battles. And in a world shouting to be heard, the quietest soul often speaks the loudest. Ready yourself, because next, we'll uncover how silence doesn't just protect you, but how it transforms your enemy and the entire energy of conflict. There's a law in this world: older than kings and wiser than any book. A law that governs not through force but through quiet, invisible threads. We call it karma, not punishment, not superstition, not some cosmic scorecard, but the natural echo of our intentions and actions, returning to us like a shadow follows the body. Every word you speak, every thought you nurture, every reaction you choose, they ripple out. And those ripples come back. Anger, as we've seen, is like hurling poison into a well you yourself must drink from. Each harsh word, each flare of resentment plants a seed in the soil of your life. And seeds grow. But here's what the ancient masters taught in voices soft as evening wind. Silence in the face of anger plants a different seed, a seed of merit, a seed of future peace. There's a passage in the Dhammapada that says, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased." This is a law eternal. It means this: every time you refuse to retaliate, you don't just avoid bad karma. You actively create good karma. You build merit. Merit isn't some mystical tally. It's the invisible force that shapes your life's circumstances, your peace of mind, and your future rebirths. When you meet anger with silence, you do more than stop harm, you reverse its current. You transform a moment of darkness into one of light. Imagine two people arguing in a room, words thrown like knives, the air thick with fury, and then one falls silent, not with bitterness, not with smugness, but with calm. That silence changes everything. It's like pouring cool water on a flame. The heat drops. The other's fury, now unmet, begins to collapse under its own weight. And in that stillness, a new karma is born, one of restraint, of clarity, of compassion. In Buddhist tradition, this isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength. Because in mastering yourself, you master your fate. We often think our destiny is controlled by fate or by others or by random chance. But it's not. It's shaped by the countless small choices we make moment by moment, especially in moments of heat. There's a reason why the Buddha likened an angry person to someone throwing burning coals with bare hands. Yes, you may hit your enemy, but you burn yourself first. Yet the one who lays the coal down, who keeps their hands cool, leaves the room without scars. This isn't just spiritual metaphor. Even modern psychology confirms it. Studies on long-term well-being show that those who practice emotional restraint, not suppression, but mindful restraint, suffer less stress, lower rates of chronic illness, and enjoy greater social bonds. And why? Because they aren't constantly accumulating the karma of conflict. They aren't sowing seeds of division. Silence is your ally in these moments. It not only stops new negative karma from forming, it generates merit. Each time you respond with peace, you strengthen your future. Your mind becomes clearer, your sleep deeper, your relationships cleaner. Even your enemies over time may forget their grievances. But your merit, it follows you like a faithful shadow. There's an old Thai forest monk named Ajahn Chah who once said, "If you let people pull your strings, they will dance you like a puppet. But if you stay still, they lose interest." And you are free. That freedom isn't just for today, it's for lifetimes. So the next time anger comes knocking from a stranger, a loved one, or the world itself, remember, your reaction isn't just about now. It's about your future. About the kind of life you'll step into tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. When you meet anger with silence, you don't just protect your peace. You shape your karma. You build merit. And slowly, you begin to transform not just your fate, but the unseen currents of your entire life. And soon, you'll see silence does something even more remarkable. It doesn't only change your future, it changes your enemy. Have you noticed how loud the world has become? Not just the traffic, not just the notifications pinging from your pocket, but the relentless noise of opinions, judgments, reactions spilling over screens, conversations, and into your mind. It's everywhere, and it demands something from you, your attention, your outrage, your participation. In ancient times, silence was simple. Monks could retreat to caves. Forest dwellers left villages behind. A world without smartphones. No endless scroll of outrage. No algorithm feeding your anger. But today, the storm follows you into your home, your pocket, your thoughts. And in this storm, to remain silent, truly silent, is not easy. It's not passive. It's a discipline, a rebellion, because the world wants you to react. It feeds on reaction. One angry comment spawns 10 more. One careless post breeds 100 replies. And before you know it, you're no longer yourself. You're just another voice in the noise. But the Buddha foresaw this. He warned of the chattering mind and the world's relentless craving for more conflict, more noise, more self. He taught that silence isn't merely the absence of words. It's the absence of craving, of the need to be heard, to win, to correct, to defend. And that kind of silence, that's where freedom lives. So, how do you practice this silence today, in a world that will not hush for you? It starts, like all worthy things, within. You wake up in the morning. Before reaching for your phone, pause, feel your breath. Notice your thoughts rising like mist, some anxious, some angry, some petty, some kind. Watch them, let them pass. Because before you speak to the world, you've already spoken 1,000 things to yourself. Then, as the day moves, pay attention to the heat. The moments when someone cuts you off in traffic, when a post online makes your blood rise, when a coworker gossips, when a friend lets you down. You'll feel it, a tightness in your chest, a fire in your throat. That's the storm. And here's where the real practice begins. Instead of reacting, pause 3 seconds, one breath. Not as suppression, but as observation. Anger is here. Frustration has arrived. Not I am angry. Not I must reply. Simply this is happening. And then choose silence. Maybe you don't reply to that message right away. Maybe you smile and walk past the gossip. Maybe you leave that comment section untouched. Silence isn't absence. It's presence without reaction. It's standing in the storm and choosing not to shout. And over time, you'll notice. The storm inside you weakens. Not because the world grew quieter, but because you no longer feed it. There's a practice in Zen called shikken taza, just sitting. Not chasing thoughts, not banishing them. Just sitting as the mind roars and quiets like waves. And you realize you don't have to answer every wave. In daily life, this means becoming intentional. Not every message needs a reply. Not every slight needs a defense. Not every wrong needs a war. Your peace is precious. Guard it. When you do speak, let it be from clarity, not compulsion. When you stay silent, let it be from wisdom, not weakness. Because in a world addicted to noise, the one who masters silence holds real power. And something beautiful happens. Your mind, once a cluttered market of voices, becomes a quiet temple. Your heart, once bruised by every sharp word, becomes a sanctuary. And people notice. Even the angriest find their fire flickering in the face of your calm. You become the still point in a spinning world. A mountain no storm can move. A cool stream in a parched land. Not because you conquered others, but because you mastered yourself. This is the practice, not escaping the world, but learning to walk through it untouched, to sit in its noise and remain whole. And the more you do, the more you'll find. Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything worth keeping. And it does something else too, something extraordinary. It disarms those who sought to pull you into their storm. And that, my friend, is where we go next. And so we arrive here, at the end of a journey that in truth never really ends, because anger will visit you again. The world will test you again. People will say things meant to wound, provoke, and pull you down. That's the nature of this life. But now, you know something different. Silence, true silence, is not about being weak. It's not defeat. It's not avoidance. It's wisdom. It's strength beyond measure. Because anyone can shout. Anyone can retaliate. It takes no training, no discipline to hurl words like daggers. But to stand in the storm, feel the fire rise within, and respond not with thunder, but with quiet, steady calm. That's the act of a master. The Buddha once said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned, and now you've seen it. Each time you retaliate, you carry that coal a little longer. You scorch your peace. You poison your own mind. But when you choose silence, not from fear, but from clarity, you drop the coal and you walk away whole. People may not understand your silence. Some might mistake it for surrender. Let them. Because you and I both know, true victory is not proving yourself right. It's keeping your peace intact. It's becoming untouchable in a world addicted to noise. There's a quiet victory in choosing not to be baited, in watching chaos swirl around you and choosing stillness, in letting insults fade into nothing as your mind stays clear. Like a mountain unmoved by the wind, that, my friend, is power. That is peace. And it leaves something behind, too. A ripple in the world. When you meet anger with calm, hostility loses its footing. You soften others by refusing to strike. You teach without words. This is what the old masters meant when they said, the greatest response to anger is no response at all. It's not silence of the lips alone, but the silence of the heart, the silence of craving, the silence of ego. And the world, it desperately needs people like that now. So when the storm comes, and it will, remember this space we built together. Remember the wisdom of the ancients. Remember the fire you've already extinguished. And choose peace, choose calm, choose silence. Not as a hiding place, but as your strongest weapon. And if this journey spoke to you, if it stirred something in your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your story, your moments of silence. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so we can walk these paths together. Because the world's noise won't stop, but neither will we. And together, in silence, we become stronger.